I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always a happily ever after.
Long ago, across a deep blue sea, there lay a beautiful island. Here, close to golden shores, stood a large village. Now the chief of this village was a very wise and gentle man, much respected by his people. The chief had a young son called Nama, who was very proud of his father and was always trying to win his approval. The chief was so wise, he knew many, many things. He knew where the largest fish were to be found. The chief decided everything in the village. How many new canoes they should build, when they should go out hunting. Whatever he decided, all the men agreed. It wasn't good that he should make all these decisions alone. So one day he called all the men of the village to his hut, telling them he had something very important he wanted to say. "Listen, men," he said. "I think if there is something important to decide for the village, we should have a meeting and decide it together." All the men agreed. And one said, "Of course, chief. You have but to call us, and we shall come." The next morning, the chief was walking down by the shore when he suddenly thought, "How shall I call the men to the meeting?" He frowned, for the village was large and the huts were scattered. Just then, his son Nama appeared at his side. "What's troubling you, father?" he asked. "I can think of no way to call my men to council." "You could shout," laughed Nama. "No, those in the furthest huts would never hear," said the chief. Suddenly Nama had an idea. Away he ran and dived straight into the water. His father watched. What was Nama up to now? Nama had found a large shell. He hurried back to his father with it. But the chief just looked at the shell and said, "However hard I blow on this, it just wouldn't be loud enough." Nama was very disappointed, for he did so want to help his father. He could see it was a big worry for the chief. He thought and thought. There must be something he could do. The next morning, Nama had an idea. Telling no one where he was going, he hurried away to the forest. There he found a piece of wood, which he began to hollow out with his knife. All day Narma stayed in the forest working away, until the sun was low in the sky and he had to return home. Again, the next morning, Narma returned to the forest to work on his piece of wood. He stayed there all day, but he still hadn't finished when night fell. The third morning found Narma still working, but finally at midday he was finished. In great excitement, he carried the log out of the forest and down towards the village. He did so hope his father would be pleased. When he arrived at his father's hut, the chief was indeed there. He was very curious to know what his son had been doing for the last few days. Narma was very excited and cried, "I've made you something to call your people with." The chief was puzzled. Why was his son bringing this log into the hut? How could he call his people with that? "You better show me how," smiled the chief. So Narma took up the stick and began to bang the hollow log with it. It did indeed make a noise. The chief was impressed. "Yes, that is loud enough for my men to hear," he said. And a faraway look came into his eyes. I remember long ago my grandfather telling me of an island he visited away in the north. There they practice the art of making drums. They hollow out the wood and stretch animal skin or cloth over either end. My grandfather trembled when they struck the drum, for its sound was truly majestic. "I have always had a longing for one," said the chief wistfully. Narma had never heard of drums before, but he cried out, "Oh, let me go, father, to this island of the drums and bring you one back." The chief was delighted with his son's idea, so it was agreed that Narma should leave early the next morning. Narma spent a restless night. He was so excited. He had never been so far from home before. It would be a very long journey. He paddled over to the beach where his father and sister were waiting to give him some wonderful gifts for the chief of Drum Island. When his father had stowed the gifts in Narma's canoe, he wished him a safe journey and pushed the canoe out to sea. They watched proudly as Narma paddled out into the bay. "He will make a fine chief one day," thought his father. Narma paddled strongly out to sea. The weather was fine, and the canoe slipped smoothly through the water. How easy it would be if I only had to paddle as far as the little island in the bay, thought Narma. But his journey was to be long and hard. Soon he was out in the wide blue ocean, his island now far behind. Though he was quite alone, sometimes a seabird would call to him as it hovered overhead, and a fish would nudge the bottom of his canoe, and this kept Narma feeling very cheerful. On and on he paddled, all day and all night. Drum Island at last. Though he was feeling tired and hungry, he felt very proud that he'd found his way to the island. As he paddled strongly up to the shore, a guard came running out of the trees and down onto the beach. He wanted to know who the young stranger was and why he'd come to Drum Island. Nama told him that he'd come from an island far in the south with gifts from his father. When the guard heard this, he was quite happy for Nama to come ashore. So Nama took the gifts and made his way up to the village, followed closely by the guard. News of the young stranger's arrival soon spread, and in no time the chief of Drum Island himself came down to greet Nama. Nama told him how he'd brought gifts from his father. The chief led the way back to his hut, and Nama could not help noticing as he followed the drum chief that he had a bad limp in one leg. As soon as Nama entered the hut, he saw before him the chief's collection of drums. "Welcome," said the drum chief. "Welcome to Drum Island." Nama then put forward the gifts from his father, saying, "Please accept my father's gifts with his compliments." The chief looked at each present carefully in turn and then showed them to his men. There was a large and beautiful shell, a wooden carving, and some pretty white beads. All the men admired the gifts, and the chief was very pleased with them. When he came to the fine mat, he slowly unwrapped it. It was very fine indeed. "Your father's gifts are most generous," said the drum chief as he looked with admiration at the mat. "In return, you may choose anything you like." Nama immediately pointed to the biggest drum. That was what he wanted. The drum chief was saddened. It was the best drum on the island. He was rightly very proud of it. The boy banged the drum and it boomed like thunder. But Nama would have no other drum. It was the biggest and the best, and that was what he wanted for his father. The chief was a very honourable man, and though he tried to persuade Nama to take a smaller drum when Nama refused, he agreed he might have the big one. He told Nama to thank his father for his generous gifts. Nama was so pleased he'd got the drum he wanted, he forgot all his manners, and without a thank you, he just jumped up and dragged the drum out of the hut and through the village. The drum chief limped after him. He was sad to lose his best drum, for it had taken many months of hard work to make it. When he saw how Nama had rudely snatched up the drum without even one word of thank you to him or his people, the drum chief was deeply shocked. Perhaps the boy would say something to redeem himself before he left. Nama was so impatient to take the drum back to his father that he just put it straight into his canoe, and without even a wave or a salute of the people of Drum Island or its chief, he jumped in and paddled away. The drum chief was very angry with Nama. He had none of his father's good manners and must be taught a lesson. Nama paddled swiftly out to sea. He was so proud he did not even realize how rude he'd been. This time, the canoe did not glide swiftly through the water, for the drum was very heavy and made paddling hard work. For some reason, there was no bird to call to him from overhead, and no fish nudged at the bottom of his canoe. He felt alone and a little frightened. was so exhausted he had to stop and rest. He began to fear that he would not have the energy to get home. As he looked around him, all he could see was the wide blue ocean, stretching away for miles and miles, with no sign of land. Then he remembered his father. He must go on for his sake. He so wanted to see the chief's face when he saw the big drum. Nama began paddling once more, and did not stop until at last he saw in the distance the little island in the bay. He was nearly home. How happy he was, for it had been a very long and tiring journey. He paddled slowly up to the beach. Wouldn't his father be pleased when he saw the fine drum? Now he would be able to call his men with great dignity. All the other chiefs would be full of admiration. Beaching his canoe, Nama carefully lifted the drum out. It was very heavy as he carried it over to his father's hut. He stood it under a tree and hurried over to find the chief. The chief was dozing. He was very pleased to be woken by his son, for he was beginning to fear that he might be lost at sea. "Come quickly, father," cried Nama. "See what I've brought you." When his father saw the magnificent drum, he was delighted. "Well done, my son," he cried. He kept admiring the big drum. Nama felt so proud. "I hope you properly thanked the drum chief for this wonderful gift." Nama was very embarrassed and said nothing. The chief saw that his son suddenly looked very pale. The chief decided that the drum should not be struck until the next afternoon. Nama would strike the first blow. But that night, while the village slept, who should come stealthily ashore but the chief of Drum Island with 3 of his men. Telling his men to wait, the drum chief made his way up the beach. The guard had eaten too much and had fallen fast asleep, so he did not see the drum chief limp up towards the village with a very determined look on his face. The guard was happily dreaming. The chief walked calmly into the village. He looked round. Where had that naughty boy hidden the drum? He must find it. Suddenly, he caught sight of it under a tree. Away went the drum chief. The sleeping guard did no more than moan gently and turn over. The village was silent as the drum chief limped over to the tree. This was the only way to teach that rude young boy a lesson he would never forget. Taking out his knife, he pierced the drum skin again and again. Though it saddened the drum chief to do this, he could not let Nama's insulting behavior go unanswered. He limped silently back to his men, and they were soon heading back to their island. The next afternoon, the village was abuzz with excitement. All the villagers made their way to the chief's hut to hear the drum be struck for the first time. Nama was the most excited person in the village. How loud the drum would boom, as majestic as thunder. At last, all the villagers had arrived and were ready. Nama made his way slowly over to the drum. The chief watched very proudly. "Now, father?" asked Nama. "Yes, strike the drum, my son." Nama struck the drum with a stick, but no sound like booming thunder was heard. Instead, only a faint thudding noise. Nama struck again and again. He was so embarrassed. "I heard it boom. I did. "Then someone has taken its voice away," said the chief sadly. An old woman came forward and said, "Chief, I saw a stranger by the drum last night. I don't know who he was, but he walked with a limp." Nama understood immediately. The chief of Drum Island had taken the drum's voice away because of his rudeness. The chief, in his wisdom, also understood, but he said nothing. His son had made a fool of himself in front of the whole village. From that day, the chief always used Nama's log to call the men to council, but he also kept the drum just in case his son forgot. Nama never did forget. Sometimes he thought he heard the sound of a great booming coming from the north. The drum's voice never did return, but Nama would never forget his manners again.